Okay, the new unit. Evolution. This is a highly controversial topic. Erroneously so. It shouldn't be controversial, but the reason it's controversial is because very few people actually understand what evolution is all about. They operate on a sort of a misunderstanding of the concepts, and then that creates all kinds of confusion. And so the first thing we're going to do is just talk briefly about evolution and what exactly it is. So the word evolution implies change. And not only does it imply change, but it implies change over a long period of time. And I think that's one of the things that people don't really understand. Evolution is change, but you should think of it as tiny and I'm going to use the word unobservable. These changes are so small that they often go unnoticed. Maybe unnoticed is a better word. Tiny, unnoticed changes over long periods of time. And one of the reasons it's so hard for humans to understand is because these periods of time are often thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, or perhaps even billions of years. And so our puny little lifetimes of at most, at best 100 years or so, that isn't enough time for us to actually be able to see evolution happening in our everyday lives. You'll see people will ask questions, well, how come haven't seen a monkey evolve into a human? Well, because you can't see evolution on the scale of a human lifetime. You will never witness evolution happening before your eyes. But what you can see is you can see the record of evolution if you zoom out and look at the evidence we have that's been left behind over much longer periods of time. So there was a time when the world was viewed to be static, unchanging. And this view was around for a very long time. The idea was simply that the world existed. It was somehow created or came into existence at some point, and the way it was then is the way it is now. And animals and plants and everything around us have always been the way they are, and unchanging. Indeed, many of our ancient religious creation stories are representative of the idea that a particular God created the world and bam, there it was. But the problem with this is that as we began to uncover evidence began to suggest that things change. And people started to realize that this static idea or static view of the world must not be an accurate prediction of what we can actually see in terms of evidence. So it's not the real story. And of course, when you have religious ideas based on a static, unchanging world, and then you challenge that by saying, wait a minute, we might be wrong about that, you can understand why it makes a lot of people upset. You can understand the threat that this new idea would be. But of course, we've learned that evidence is the best way to understand the universe, because it's the only way that's objective enough that we can all understand it in the same way, and that we can observe it being reflected in our reality. So let's talk about some of the evidence for things changing. Well, one of the most common things is the fact that when humans began to interact with wild animals, eventually they learned to control. So humans learned to control the outcome of breeding animals and plants, actually, animals and plants, by carefully selecting the parents. Now, this is tied into, of course, the genetics that we've recently studied. What this means is that we can take particular parents with particular traits, and if we're very careful about who mates with who, we can find that these traits can become somehow more common in the offspring. So, to give you an example, we've done all kinds of crosses and things with Punnett squares. If you take, let's just say there's a simple gene for black and white, all right, black and white fur coloring. So black being dominant, and then the small letter B for white. Well, if we take those two and we look at the different combinations, a black animal could have two genotypes. It could be homozygous or heterozygous, because the dominant black will take over. But for a white individual, you can only have this combination. So what happens when you cross blacks and whites? Well, if you cross the first one with the allele, you can see the only possible allele you would get is a heterozygous black offspring. All of the babies would be black. But if you cross this one, which has two options, right? If you use this one here, then you can get some black and some white. So all you have to do is be very careful as to which parents you pick. If you pick this parent and this parent, you end up with black. If you like black, then that's what you could do. And so once we understood this, we realized that we can select particular traits, and through careful breeding, generation after generation after generation, we can control the outcome of particular traits in a population. And the best example of that, of course, are dogs. So what are dogs? Well, dogs are a species. They're all one species, okay, called Canis familiaris, the familiar wolf. And we believe that dogs did evolve from wolves. And the reason is because they share so many similarities. Now, how would this have happened? So early on, wolves would have been in close proximity to humans. And over time, the wolves and the humans might have developed a kind of like a symbiosis. Now, when I say over time, I don't mean 6 months. I'm talking about two populations living in the same proximity for thousands of years. And so what can happen is, we have a wolf. We all know what a wolf looks like, right? Most wolves look very similar. Now, there's many different types of wolf, obviously, but think about the common timber wolf. In fact, they're so similar, they look so similar to us that we can't tell them apart. If I showed you two wolves, I told you one was named Ralph and one was named Loretta, and then I jumbled them up and said, okay, which one is which? You'd have a hard time trying to decide which one was which, because they look so similar. In fact, you couldn't even really tell which one was the boy and which was the girl unless you got a really close-up look. And so at first glance, we think of other species as being all the same, but they're not. What's important to realize is there are small differences across any species. With humans, it's more obvious because we're humans, and so we use these differences to identify each other. We all kind of look similar in our body shape, and we have similar attributes, but It's easier for us to determine who our friend is and who our friend isn't. We know what our mother looks like. And when we look at a group of people, we can differentiate them very easily because we are tuned into those small differences. But dogs can do that too, or wolves. A bunch of timber wolves are quite aware of who's who. They can tune into the small differences of wolves, and they can also identify individuals. And they do it often not just by sight, but also by smell. We don't have a very good sense of smell compared to other animals, so we miss a lot of those things. So these small differences do exist. But it's important to realize that the differences are so small that they don't make an overall obvious difference. In other words, it's easy to see big differences, right? If we took a squirrel and a lion, well, you'd have to be pretty unobservant to be able to confuse those two. They're very different. How close do you have to get before things become not so different? Well, we could say a tiger is a little bit more like a lion, right? But we can still tell the difference. If I showed you two pictures, you'd say, oh yeah, that's a tiger, that's a lion. Now, there comes a point where the differences become so small that we use the word species. A species is a population of animals that are so closely related to each other. They have such a small number of differences, or very tiny differences, that we consider them all the same species. Now here's the trick. How do you know? You don't know just by looking. We had to come up with a better way to do it. So in a species, we say that things belong together as a species if they can produce viable offspring. Now, the word viable here means two things. It means that the offspring will live, but it also means that the offspring can have more babies of their own. That's an incredibly important part. Viable offspring means that those babies can continue on and have more babies. So when humans mate, we produce babies that can then have more babies and more babies and more babies, and the generations continue. If you try to make a squirrel and you try to mate that with a lion, things don't work. And the reason they don't work is because each of these different species has different kinds of genes and chromosomes in their cells, and they don't match up properly. Remember that when you mate, a sperm and an egg are the haploid number, and they're supposed to match. If your haploid numbers don't match up, if the chromosomes are all different, you're going to end up in essentially a cell that dies. So there'd be no offspring. There'd be no baby that could be produced from such a different combination of animals. If you get a little closer, for instance, a tiger and a lion, we have done this. We have taken a lion and a tiger and mated them. Now, we can mate them artificially, right? We can collect sperm and eggs and do it in a lab rather than try to get the animals to do it themselves. And when we do, we found something interesting. We get a live baby. Something will be born from this combination. And I believe they called it a liger. But the liger is sterile. It is unable to produce more ligers. And so the whole thing stops. And that's why we can say that a lion and a tiger are not the same species, because the offspring that they can produce are not able to continue producing more of that particular organism. You can make one liger, but you can't make two ligers, mate them, and then have more baby ligers. It doesn't work. In order to be able to mate and have viable offspring, you have to be a member of the same species. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of what species means. Let's go back to our wolves. Wolves are all part of the same species. So if we pick the timber wolf, let's say, right? which is the common wolf that we're familiar with. It looks like a husky dog, and a timber wolf look very much the same. And that's one of the reasons why we can tell that perhaps dogs and wolves have some kind of evolutionary connection. So we take a timber wolf. What you have is an entire bunch of wolves, a whole population of wolves, with some differences or variation. That's the key word that we use in evolution, variation. Just like if you look around your family, you all look very similar. You all, have very similar body plans and things, but there's some variation. Some are slightly taller, some are slightly shorter. Some have slightly darker hair or slightly lighter hair. Some skin tones are a little lighter or darker. Some have maybe perhaps more volatile tempers, and some are more complacent and reserved. Some are more extroverted, some are more introverted. All of these little things, these variations, which can be variations in our physical. They can be physical variations, but they can also be behavioral, right? Things you like and dislike, personality traits, all kinds of things can be variations. So a population always has some variation. We are not all identical, and that is the key thing for understanding how evolution can work. And scientists back in the day, back in the 1800s and perhaps even earlier, recognized this. And they knew that this was the case, but they really hadn't had enough evidence available to them to put the whole thing together. Okay, so what we did as people is we liked certain things. We liked wolves, first of all, that maybe were less aggressive. So what would happen if out of all those wolves, here I'm going to use little dots, these are all the wolves in the population. Okay, they're all pretty much the same, but they have small variable differences, small variations. So what I do is I find this wolf right here tends to be much more passive. It doesn't get growly and angry. And this one over here is the same. These are the two most passive wolves in the bunch. What if I pick those two wolves and I mate them together? Well, we know now from our understanding of genetics that the passive nature of these two wolves is somehow reflected in their genes. Back in the day of people like Charles Darwin, who was the father of evolution, he didn't know this. He was working on his theory right around the same period of time that Gregor Mendel was working on his, but they were aware that there was some kind of thing going on, right? Some factor. And so what would end up happening is we would get babies from this pair. But these babies would all be inheriting the genes for being slightly less aggressive, which means in the second generation, we would have less aggression across the population. Less aggression. There would still be variations in this population, this F2 generation, we'll call it, right? But overall, there'd be less aggression. Okay, so now we take out of this group the two least aggressive, and we mate them. We get a next generation. Well, what's going to happen now is when they have babies, most of these babies will be less aggressive across the board than the F2 generation. And over time, if we did this 1,000 times, or even 100,000 times, right? You just, every generation of wolves, after many, many, many centuries, millennia, thousands, millions, I got 1,000 here, 1,000,000 years, eventually you're going to have changed the population of wolves by specifically picking the least aggressive. And now you have an animal that's not aggressive at all. And in fact, even though after 1,000 years you would have a variation, all of these would be far less aggressive than the originals, because we specifically picked the least aggressive each time. And we've been able to do this. We know this works. We can do it with not just aggression. We can do it with behaviors like guarding, We can breed dogs by picking the best guards. We can pick the best ones at herding sheep, and we can breed them and produce a whole breed of dogs that is really good at doing that one specific thing. We can also do it with shapes. We can make great big dogs, right? Big guard dogs. We can make little cute Chihuahua dogs that are so small they could fit in your pocket. And they bark and they go rip, 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 rip. They make lots of noise. And we can do this by selecting. What we're doing is we're doing it as humans, so we call it artificial selection. Right? We choose which parents mate, essentially. And we choose the ones that have which parents mate. We choose the ones with the most desirable traits. Now, it doesn't work once. You don't just pick two, mate them, and voila, new species. You have to do it hundreds of thousands of times. You have to do it over many, many, many generations. But if you do, you will see a very slow progression from one trait to another. So essentially what we're doing here, when we choose which parents mate, we choose the desirable traits, we are artificially selecting which genes. We are selecting which alleles of a particular gene get passed on to the future generations. And consequently, if we don't select particular alleles because we don't like them, then they will slowly disappear from the population after selective breeding over and over and over again. And so this artificial selection has happened to the point where we have all kinds of different dogs. Big dogs, small dogs, little long dog, wiener dogs. We have big fat dogs, right? We have produced so many different dogs that it's hard to keep up. All the different breeds. Labradors, mountain dogs, poodles, golden doodles, and all the different dogs. Huskies, collies, and so on. But you know what's interesting about all these dogs that we have produced? They are all the same species. And what that means is that I can take a little Chihuahua and I can mate it with a husky and produce a dog. And they will mate and they will produce viable offspring that can continue to have more dogs. So as much as they look vastly different, the Chihuahua and the husky are still the same species. The only reason they look so vastly different is because we have purposely selected their genes to create all these crazy variations. We have highlighted the variations. The very small variations in that original wolf population have been sort of manipulated and exaggerated by our selective breeding to produce what looks like two completely different species. But they're not. They still are Canis familiaris. Husky and Chihuahua can breed and produce viable offspring. Now, if we were to continue with this process for many, many more years, it is quite conceivable that eventually we would produce two animals, whatever they would be, because they would have changed so much we wouldn't even know what they look like, which could not mate together and produce viable offspring. And then we would essentially have created an entirely new species. But human beings have not been doing this long enough. We just haven't been breeding dogs long enough to produce a new species. All we've been able to do is sort of go halfway and produce a one species that has such obvious variations. And we can do this with artificial selection. We also use artificial selection for plants, for instance. If you think of a corn on the cob, you think of a nice, juicy corn with all the corn on it here, right? And we eat that, it's delicious. But corn on the cob did not always look like this. The very first corn, which is called maize, was a little grain, probably about this big, with a few little seeds in it. It certainly wasn't something you'd put in a pot and roast. It was usually just mashed or ground up into a flour to be used. But guess what? The people who discovered this decided when they grew it, and they had a whole bunch of little plants growing, they picked the largest of those plants and mated them. And now you get a population. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to redo this. I'm going to do a visual as well. I think I can do this visually, sort of. Kind of show you how it works. So here's a population of plants, and I'm going to draw some small and some really big, right? So they're all sort of the same, but we're going to go and find some variation in all these plants. They're not precisely the same. So I go and I pick the biggest ones. I take this one and perhaps this one, and I mate them. Now those are carrying some genes for bigness, aren't they? Obviously, if you look at this little one here, I'm going to circle in yellow, his genes do not indicate very big. And so what we're doing is we're taking these and we're going to create new offspring. So here's what you'll get. You'll get some tall ones and some short ones. Still variation. But if you look at the average size, the average overall size has gone up because we picked the biggest ones. Now let's pick the next biggest ones for our next generation, this one and this one. Let's mate them. What do we get? Well, we get some big ones and some small ones, variation, but notice what's happened. There's still variation, but overall the average height has gone up. And then we pick the biggest, and you can see how we just continue with this process over many generations. And we get bigger and smaller, but overall you can see how the size has gotten bigger. And we've done this with corn. We've turned corn from this little rinky-dink maize plant into the giant corn on the cob that we all love to eat so much by doing this repeatedly. In a sense, we have selected the particular trait of size by manipulating which parents get to breed, which means those are the alleles of genes that are passed on. And you can see how we have this plant. Now it's still corn. Even though it looks very different, it's kind of like the dogs. They look very different, but it's still corn. If we continue this on for many hundreds of thousands of years, is it conceivable that we could turn corn into a whole new species? It is. But we haven't been doing it long enough to see that. So we don't really know. That experiment has yet to happen. All right. Now, this is all artificial selection, right? That's what we called it, artificial selection. In other words, humans have been purposely selecting alleles and genes to get a desired product. In order for this to be the way the world works, what kind of selection would Mother Nature use? In other words, we need some sort of what we call natural selection to happen. Natural selection is a very important mechanism to understanding evolution. It's the way that nature, how does nature pick? If you have a bunch of animals, how does nature decide which parents get to mate? Choose parents for mating. You would think it would just be kind of random, but the truth is, Mother Nature does choose parents. There is a way that Mother Nature can decide which parents get to breed. Okay, so hold on to that thought. Here's another example that we see around us, another example of this selection process. There's this weird thing that people notice, people who study animals. They notice something called mimicry. And essentially that's when one animal looks almost exactly like another animal, even though they're not the same species at all. And you have to wonder, why would that be the case? If things were just created, would it make sense that you would have, for instance, the monarch butterfly, right? And maybe if I switch to some pictures here, we'll go to the internet for a second and just look at some pictures. And if I monarch versus a viceroy. and we'll go to images here, and we can see these two butterflies. I'll try to bring up this one here. You can see it on the right-hand side. If you took a quick glance at these two butterflies, you would say, oh, they're the same, aren't they? But a closer inspection reveals some tiny differences. If you look at the bottom wings, you'll see there's a sort of a band across the bottom of the Viceroy, which doesn't exist on the Monarch. And the spots are not quite the same. And there's some differences that you can point out. Now, the Monarch and the Viceroy are two completely different butterflies. Why on earth would the Viceroy look so much like a monarch? That's called mimicry. The Viceroy mimics the monarch. Now, there's a very good reason for wanting to mimic this monarch. Monarchs are poisonous and distasteful. When animals eat monarchs, they spit them out because they don't like them. Now, if you're an animal who's already eaten a few monarchs and you've learned that they taste bad, are you likely to take a bite of that Viceroy? Probably not, because it looks so much like the poisoned one. Keep that in mind, all right? Let me show you another example. The coral snake versus the king snake. Let's have a look at some images here. Okay, you can see from all these pictures that these two snakes look very similar. In fact, if you were to look at this picture right here in the right-hand side, you can see the coral snake, the scarlet king snake. They both have bands of red, yellow, and black. But the order of those bands is slightly different. If you look at the scarlet king snake, you can see that the red band is sandwiched between two black bands. In other words, red touches black. But if you look at the coral snake, you can see the red is sandwiched between two yellow bands. In other words, red touches yellow. Here's a good example here, this picture. You can see them. And there's also some differences in the size of the bands and things like that. But if you weren't, too astute and knew a whole lot about snakes, you might confuse these two snakes easily. The scarlet king snake is non-venomous. It's harmless. Might bite you, but it's just going to be a little pick. It's not going to be anything bad. But the eastern coral snake is highly venomous and could possibly cause extreme illness or death. So you don't want to mix these up. Why would the scarlet king snake look so much like the eastern coral snake? Why would it mimic this snake, and how did it get this way? Well, the obvious reason is because if an animal had encountered a venomous eastern coral snake and had a very bad experience, and then it saw the king snake, it would likely say, ooh, I think I've seen that before. I'm going to stay the heck away. So the animals that prey upon snakes might change their behaviors, and in doing so, they might actually be selecting certain snakes to live over others. Okay, so there's two examples, the snake and the monarch butterfly. Let's go back to our note here, and let's see how this might happen. Now, let's say you have a butterfly. There, we'll just and here's a different butterfly. Okay, it's going to have different wings. My pictures are terrible, but this one will have spots, and this one will have stripes. This is going to be our poisonous, yucky tasting butterfly. So out in the wild, you have these two species, right? And they're floating around, and predators are coming, and they're eating the poison one and spitting it out and going, ugh. But they're eating this other one who happens to be delicious. Now, let's look at the population of this one more closely. Here it is. I'm going to draw this butterfly. I'm going to draw 3 different butterflies, but you can imagine hundreds of thousands or millions of different butterflies, right? They're all the same species, but remember how we said they have slight variation. So this one has dots all over it, like the other one. This one has dots, but some of the dots are a little more elongated. Just a touch. And maybe this one has just, maybe not so elongated dots. Okay. You're a predator now. You know that stripes could mean death, but dots mean delicious. If you were faced with these 3 butterflies to eat, which ones would you pick? There's a chance you might notice, even subconsciously, that some of these dots look a little bit like stripes. Just enough, just a little bit. It might not even be something you would notice. It's kind of like you're like, is that a dot or a stripe? I don't know, but I'm not taking the chance. And so what you would do is you would not eat this one. You would eat these. And of course, if you're eating these, there's going to be fewer of them left in the population to breed, and more of these ones that have slightly elongated spots. So now, guess what happens next generation? There's a much better chance that 2 of the elongated spots are going to be around to mate because they've been left alive. There's more of them. The predators have eaten all the others. The chances of mating with one that's only dotted is now slim. And so you have this mating, and it produces butterflies. But guess what? The butterflies have variation. Variation. And that variation means that these butterflies are really looking bad, but that's okay. Some will have slightly elongated spots. Some will have just more or less elongated. Well, out of these, which one would you eat? Well, the one here has even more elongation now. And so we'll eat these ones, but this one survives. Imagine this happening over many generations. Eventually you would get another butterfly, and most of them would have elongated spots that look almost like stripes. And then you would go back and say, hey, that butterfly looks almost like this poisonous one. But the reason is because over thousands and thousands of generations, Mother Nature has selected every single butterfly that has slightly longer dots. And it took a long time because the difference is so small. It's not like one has stripes and one has dots, right? And it takes many, many thousands of generations for this to happen. But here we now have a mimic. And the only way it could happen is if a completely different butterfly somehow was able to be selected by nature. And of course, in this case, it's the predators who are selecting for this particular butterfly to change or evolve. Okay, one more example. If we imagine this beautiful little place here, and there's food on the trees, apples hanging from the tree. We'll make a big tree. Okay, now imagine a population of people. Now this is not a real example, but it's a sort of a made-up example to sort of highlight the whole point I'm trying to make. These people will have some tall, some short, right? There'll be some variation in height, but they're all one species. Okay, the food they have to eat is the apple. Well, the tallest ones are going to be able to reach the most apples. This poor little fella on the end here, he may not be able to reach any apples, which means without any food, he's probably going to die before he has a chance to have babies. Now that's sad, but it is the way of Mother Nature. Which means that the chances are bigger or greater that the tallest members will be able to provide offspring. And just like we had the corn getting bigger each time, these 2 offspring, because they have the allele for tall, will produce a variation of people, all of which are slightly taller, but there will still be some variation. Now you have a tree, right? But now, most of the apples from down below have been picked away by the last generation or by the people who were shorter, and now only the tallest of these, this guy, for instance, and this guy, can reach these, but our little short people are again selected against. And so what's happening here is not predators, but a change in the environment, a change in the availability of resources. A change in the environment. Right? A change in the availability of resources, which is actually selecting for the tallest individuals. And so over many, many generations, you would see the average height of this particular group of individuals increase. And over thousands and millions of years, all of these little changes could add up to an entirely new species. And so this process of change, I'm going to summarize now because we've learned a lot here. Here's the key points. 1, the concept of a species can produce viable offspring. That's important. And understanding what viable means. It means that your babies can still have babies, not just that the babies survive. So that's the first important thing. Now, species contain variation in their traits. Variation, viable offspring, these are the key points. These tiny variations can be advantageous. If you happen to be slightly taller and you're going to get the apples, then you have an advantage over the other shorter people. All right? These tiny variations can be advantageous, but it's the environment you're in. The environment determines what is advantageous or not. Tall might not always be better. Tall might be really great in one environment where there's food up high, but tall may not matter in an environment where there's lots of food down below. So what's interesting is the environment that things live in, that includes the available resources, it includes the predators that would be attacking them, it includes the diseases and all the things that they're living with. That determines what is advantageous. And by what I should say, what alleles, what genes, right? Because the genes are what give us all these traits. So perhaps I should have written here, what traits are advantageous? The environment determines it. With artificial selection, we determined it with dogs and corn because we wanted certain things. We wanted cute dogs and large corn on the cobs. But in nature, no one's picking the cutest dog. What's happening is the environment that these animals live in is essentially causing this choice to happen. And the other key point is that a change in the environment changes the advantages. And that's key. Because you might be well suited to your environment, being tall with all the apples up high and living the high life. But then suddenly there's a drought and all the trees die and there's no food available any longer up high. And the other short people have learned to eat something else that's down low and you can't eat it because it makes you sick. Who knows? The environment changes. That means, I should have wrote advantages there. That means that there's no real right or wrong. Evolution is a process that completely changes all the time. You could be awesome in one environment and terrible in another. And if the environment changes, then a whole new set of traits would be selected for. And that's what drives the change from species to species. So a species living in the same environment might not change much at all. But you suddenly change the environment, you change the rules of the game, and that species might actually start to evolve into something completely different because a new selection is happening. And this is, of course, what we call natural selection, this concept. All right? So is the process of one species giving rise to another species over many generations. And natural selection is the mechanism that makes it work. So evolution is what's happening, natural selection is how it's happening. Now, natural selection, we'll talk more about in the next video. We'll get into some more details, and I just wanted to give you a basic overview of the concept of evolution and how we know that this is the case. Why do we know this is the case? Because we see it. We see the evidence for evolution all around us. We see it in the fossil record. We see it in mimicry. We see it in dog breeding. We see it in breeding of plants and animals. And we see all of this at work. So we know that this is happening. This is not an idea. You don't believe in evolution. There's no belief here. It's like saying, I don't believe in gravity. Well, you're still going to fall, right? Evolution is not a belief. It's not a religious faith. It's an actual scientific theory that we have evidence to support, and you don't really get a choice on whether or not you believe in it. It's just the way it is. Okay, we'll stop there, and we'll deal with natural selection in more detail.